The title of my paper today is Targeting the Cultural History of Iraq and the implications this may or may not have for nationalism and democracy in Iraq. I sort of start by confessing that this is very much in its infancy. In the spirit of a work-in-progress day, I'm only just sort of feeling out this idea. But over the last few months of my PhD, I just submitted my PhD last week. You can cheer now. Over the last few months of my PhD, I became really interested in this idea of cultural history and the role that cultural history has played in building degrees of nationalism and social cohesion within Iraq. And I then became interested in the question, so what happens if this cultural history is destroyed? If you target the cultural history and destroy the cultural history, do you at the same time also destroy the nationalism and social cohesion that this cultural history has come to represent and has been built up to represent? So the questions and the direction that I'm heading in is sort of outlined, I guess, by these questions. And again, it flows on quite nicely from what Anna was saying, I think, about Althusser and the idea of ideological state apparatus, and also Hobsbawm and Ranger, and this idea of the invention of tradition and using the past as an ideological tool to build nationalism and so on. So the questions and the directions that I'm going in with this is really to what extent has the destruction of Iraq's cultural or historical landscape played a part in eroding this nationalism and social cohesion? So while we've had the erosion of nationalism and social cohesion, have we also then contemporaneously seen the rise of ethno-religious sectarianism? And also, what impact would all of this have on Iraq's fledgling democratic order? But if I'm going to talk about the cultural history of Iraq, it's worth mentioning and reviewing how this cultural history has been used to build nationalism and social cohesion in the history of Iraq. And there's a long history of this from 1921 really until 2003. A series of different regimes have used the rich and complex history of Iraq as a political tool to build this idea of the nation state. And certainly there's a lot of work that has been done on this, but I just wanted to focus briefly to give some sort of context to this on the era of Saddam Hussein from 1979 to 2003. The oil wealth that pours into Iraq through the late 70s and through the 80s enables Saddam to enact a nation-building campaign on a scale that is unprecedented within Iraq, within the modern nation-state of Iraq. And he does this via a whole heap and the Ba'ath do this via a whole heap of different facets to this same project, I think. One is developing this cult of personality, and what's particularly interesting, I mean, we all know that his image was ubiquitous across the nation, for everything from the front page, every day on the front page of the newspaper, through to various statues and murals and so on. But what's particularly interesting, as that top example I think illustrates, is that he was very adept at situating himself within cultural history, that he very much tried to associate the Ba'ath and indeed his leadership as not only kind of a people's revolution, but also the kind of legitimate legatees of this rich cultural history. And he did this by situating himself among the symbols of Iraq's past, and you can see some of them in that top mural there. There was also, quite unashamedly, the extensive project called the Project for the Rewriting of History, which is a great title, I think, very blatant, which was basically to re-engineer this long and complex and rich history of Iraq to, again, put forward the idea that the Ba'ath really are the legitimate results, that they're the people's saviours, if you like, and that Saddam Hussein is a natural result of this long and complex history, a kind of descendant of the ancient kings of Mesopotamia and so on. He's often seen alongside figures such as Nebuchadnezzar in such murals. Paralleling this is also an extensive Mesopotamian program, and to reinvent and reappropriate Mesopotamia to suit the Ba'ath and Saddam's agenda. And this is done through Iraqi folklore, spring festivals, things like rebuilding Babylon, which you can see at the bottom image there, where every brick was emblazoned with the name of Saddam Hussein. Just as an aside, because originally Nebuchadnezzar, when he built Babylon, put his name on every brick, so he decided to do the same thing. And the reason I think that the Ba'ath, and very cleverly that the Ba'ath and Saddam emphasised Mesopotamia is because by emphasising Mesopotamia, you forego many of the contemporary schisms within Iraqi society. So if you say we're all descendants of this ancient heritage, then we're no longer Sunni, Shia or Kurd, we're all Mesopotamians, we're all Sumerians and so on. And then there's various monuments, all of which were built to celebrate the victory, the alleged victory of the Iran-Iraq War, and all of which were completed prior to the end of the Iran-Iraq War. Called the Victory Arches, the Unknown Soldiers Monument, the Martyrs Memorial and so on. And there's an extensive cultural campaign of museums, libraries, performing arts centres, etc. So there's a lot of money goes into this kind of nation-building campaign. I think that it's right to assert that all of these different facets of this campaign can be seen in two ways. I think that foremost they can be seen as sort of representations of the megalomania and tyranny of Saddam and the kind of despotism of the Ba'athist regime and the idea that they were trying to build legitimacy and maintain their hegemony. But at the same time, I think that they are also symbols of nationalism, that they did play a function in building social cohesion and national identity within the Iraqi state. And it's important to note that they were all distinctly Iraqi. Every one of these different symbols that were built throughout this time was specifically designed not to emphasise Sunni or Shia or Kurdish identity, but to emphasise Iraqi identity, that we are all one nation. So I want to talk, you could talk a little bit about 1991 and some of the cultural historical damage done then, but I'll focus mostly on post-2003 because it's certainly the most contemporary example. I think it's indicative of the US acknowledgement, if you like, of the power of political symbols, that one of the first things they do when they roll into Baghdad on the 9th of April is to tear down the giant bronze statue of Saddam in Firdos Square. And as we probably all know, it was kind of sold to the world as the spontaneous actions of a people's liberation, has since been documented as being a very carefully choreographed moment of PSYOPs genius. A lady that I met when I was in Jordan in 2006, who identifies herself as being a secular Iraqi Shia woman from Baghdad, said, I cried the day they tore down the statue of Saddam. I cried and laughed and danced and clapped, but later I thought, who do they, the US, think they are? Are they really any better than Saddam? Who are they to tear down our history and culture, our national identity? We should be the ones taking down those statues, or maybe we should leave them there to remember. And I think what's interesting in this comment, there's a few interesting things. One is certainly that, firstly, in the extended comment, this is drawn out much better. She acknowledges that he was a brutal tyrant, but she then goes on to acknowledge that he was our brutal tyrant. He's part of our cultural history, and questions, is it okay for someone else, a foreign regime, to come in and tear down your cultural history? If anyone should be doing it, it should be us. Or maybe we should leave it there to remember. So that was the 9th of April 2003, and I'm sure most of you know that from the 10th to the 12th of April there was massive looting and arson and so on across most of Iraq, but mostly concentrated in Baghdad. Just two very drastic examples, I think, are those of the Iraq National Museum and the Iraq National Library and Archive. You can see photos there. The top one there is the museum and the bottom one there is the archive. And interestingly, at the time, since the US has been accused of sort of gross negligence of not protecting the cultural history of Iraq in these early days of sort of conquering the nation. And it's worth noting that they did not fail to protect the Ministry of Oil, quite tellingly in this time. But they did fail to protect Iraq's cultural history landscape. So in the museum, we see that 15,000